And now let's talk to Keith Krach, the former Undersecretary of State in the Trump administration, the billionaire founder of DocuSign, which probably a lot of you guys out there have used, and Ariba. And I did some work for Keith Krach a year or two ago, and when he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize because he took such a courageous stance in opposition to the Chinese government. He was the highest-ranking government official from America to visit Taiwan in 40 years. And for that, China sanctioned him personally and his family and his businesses and sent some jets near Taiwan airspace. And so Keith Krach knows a thing or two about China, and I look forward to hearing his insights. Thanks for being with us, Keith. And why don't we start off with this? Is China the biggest threat to world order and peace, or is there a bigger one?
No, China is the biggest threat. There's no question about it. It's their sheer magnitude. And also, if you look at the General Secretary Xi of the Chinese Communist Party, he is now a dictator for life. And there hasn't been a dictator with that much power since 1945. And he's got unlimited ambitions. And clearly, there's two main objectives that he has. Number one, above all else, is regime preservation. But number two is global world domination.
And is this him personally, or do you think this is a Chinese Communist Party ambition?
Well, he heads the Chinese Communist Party. He is the Chinese Communist Party. So, and he's eliminated all opposition to him. So, yeah, it is the Chinese Communist Party. And when I think about the 1.2 billion Chinese people who are not part of that elite Chinese Communist Party, they're living under a surveillance state that's like 1984. And she's committing genocide in Xinjiang. He has no regard for human life.
No regard for human life. Do you think there's a split between the way the Chinese government views America and the American people and the way the Chinese people view America?
Well, one thing for sure is that, over the years, and also she's really amped it up, is really brainwashing the Chinese people that Americans are the enemy. Even in their history books, they claimed that the United States was behind the opium wars of 100 years ago, which, was the Brits. Americans weren't even there. So, he's really got these guys amped up, and then he's backed it up with a whole new set of laws and regulations. And one of the most dangerous ones is the Chinese Intelligence Act that requires any Chinese company, state owned or otherwise, and any Chinese citizen to turn over any information, data, proprietary technology to the Chinese government or suffer the consequences. You're either going to the gulag or your grandma is. And so he's basically weaponized the population. But, if you look at what he's doing, he's playing the long game. He's playing for keeps, a four-dimensional game of diplomatic, economic, military, and cultural chess. But the crossroads and the main battlefield is technology, and that's what he's focused on. And these guys are playing with very little respect for human rights, for intellectual property, rule of law, sovereignty of nations, the environment, and human rights.
I'm surprised. I had such high hopes for China, and I've talked about this before on the podcast. When I went there to adopt my daughter in 2001, I felt like I visited several times. I felt like capitalism would overtake China, would lift up the people, would provide more freedom. And instead, China has gotten only more strict. It has cracked down even more, despite some capitalism aspects going into the country. And it's kind of sad to see, Keith. Now, let's talk about.
And by the way, I want to say something, Dennis. Yeah. You're not alone in that. We all believe that. I've been going to China since 1981. I'm a lover of Chinese culture, the history, the people, certainly the food. But the last trip that I took to China when I was running DocuSign in 2017, I had a chance to meet with 7 of the top 9 Politburo members. I could see these guys were hell bent, where they've turned up their market competition to a new form of techno-economic aggression. I saw their drone swarm technology. They were telling me to download 10 cent every hour. The first time I heard about the One Belt, One Road, it looked like a military supply chain to me. And, as I was flying back on the plane, Dennis, I said to my wife, the guys with the best technology win the war. And these guys are really up to no good. And I wonder what the people in Washington think about it. And I made it my mission to find out. And that's when I was asked to serve.
It feels, Keith, as if China, I used to think they just wanted to compete and replace us, even if it meant cheating to replace us at the top of the leadership of the world economically and militarily. But now it feels like they want to do worse than that, more than just replace us or relegate us to unimportance. No, they want to take us down. They want to destroy us almost, it feels like. Is that overdoing it?
Well, their plan is that China's the Middle Kingdom, all roads lead to Beijing, and subjugate not just countries in South America and Africa and Southeast Asia, but all countries around the world to the will of the Chinese Communist Party. And that's what's really scary. As a businessman out here in Silicon Valley, I've seen a lot. And so if Dennis, let's maybe pretend you're a Silicon Valley CEO and I'm China. Well, if I can steal your intellectual property, I don't have to be transparent. I don't have to be reciprocal with my market. I can use slave labor, the Uyghurs that they send throughout China, $300 a month. You have to compete against that. These huge, unregulated coal-fired power plants in Xinjiang, and I don't have to obey the law, or I am the law. I'm going to beat you every time. And, I'm a believer in the free market, but when somebody comes in the market and doesn't play by the rules, the market's no longer free. It's a fool's market, and you've got to do something about that. And that's exactly what we did.
Now, I felt like President Trump was the first U.S. president to stand up to China and the first U.S. president to start talking about this. And I helped Lou Dobbs with his book, The Trump Century. And Trump had been saying a lot of these similar things about China or Japan for a good 20, 30 years. He believes a lot of the stuff that you're saying. And then he had that one deal where for the first time, China was making some concessions and agreeing that would stop demanding intellectual property in exchange for approving partnerships in China. It agreed to buy $200 billion in U.S. goods. I think all of that kind of frittered away when the administration changed hands.
Well, China, when I was back at the State Department, I had a request. I said, go back, you guys, and check last 40 years of agreements we've entered in with China. They had, and what we found out, they had not honored one of them that didn't suit their purposes. So, if you do an agreement with the Chinese Communist Party, it's a one-way agreement. I think, to be honest with you, they're almost giggling inside because they know you'll honor it and they won't. So it all boils down to trust. And what was interesting for me, Dennis, is in my first 60 bilaterals with my foreign counterparts, finance ministers, economic ministers, foreign ministers, prime ministers, I'd be his bilateral with him. I'd say, hey, how's your relationship with China? They go, oh, well, they're really important trading partner. But then it seemed like almost every time they look like both ways, like somebody's in the room, and then they go, but we don't trust them. And that really rang bells in my head because I've just been standing up in front of, all the DocuSign employees going, hey, we're not in the software business, we're in the trust business. And that's the most important word in the world.
Right. I do want to hear your views on China and Taiwan, but first let's go a little bit deeper into trust and the trust doctrine that you kind of devised, I believe, and that's part of your whole thing about how to either rein in China or deal with it. Tell us more about that.
Yeah. So, the question is, how do you compete against China? Yeah. I was asked in my Senate Confirmation Committee hearing, what would be my strategy in terms of combating China's economic aggression? I said, look, I will harness U.S.'s three biggest areas of competitive advantage by rallying and unifying our allies and our partners, leveraging the resources and innovation of the private sector, and amplifying the moral high ground of democratic trust principles. And that trust doctrine is about things like integrity, accountability, reciprocity, transparency, respect for rule of law, respect for property, respect for human rights, respect for the environment, all those things that we honor and they don't. And what we did with the trust doctrine is, in one jujitsu move, we flipped them on their back and used it against them. In essence, we weaponized the very principles that protect our freedoms. And we utilize that, for example, in building the Clean Network Alliance of Democracies to defeat China's master plan to control 5G. It looked like their national champion, their most important company, the backbone of their surveillance state, Huawei, was going to run the table around the world. And, 5G is more than just cell phones. It's utility systems, power grids, sanitation systems, Internet of Things, manufacturing process, autonomous vehicles. And so this was critical. So we built this alliance, which included 60 countries representing 2/3 of the world's global GDP, 200 telcos, a host of industry-leading companies. And what was really key about that is it provided a security blanket against China's retaliation, intimidation, and retribution, because there's strength in numbers and there's power in unity and solidarity.
And these 200 companies, what did they agree to do? They agreed to avoid buying Huawei equipment and other Chinese gear. Is that right?
Yes. So they would only buy trusted technology. And basically, trusted technology comes from suppliers that honor those things, honor those trust principles.
Yeah. Is there a way that China could go to the people and say, well, we do honor it? I mean, was there a proof point? Did you have to pass a series of tests to qualify, or is it just known that no, China doesn't?
Well, they certainly tried. They follow us around everywhere. But, I don't care who you are. You don't trust China. I mean, how can you? And so, I mean, that was, and what China tried to do is seduce with money and reinforce with intimidation, retaliation. So that's what we were up against. They like to find the weak gazelle that's wandered off from the herd, and then they go after him. That was really the big thing. And we utilized those principles also in terms of putting together a clean capital markets campaign, because unbeknownst to most average U.S. citizens, they've been financing China's military buildup, their surveillance state, which enables genocide. And the way it happens is that China's, they practice deception and concealment. So they create all these unnatural subsidiaries for all these companies that do this stuff. Then they seduce with money, the MSCI index, the FTSE index, Bloomberg Bond Fund. And then that gets buried into BlackRock's 431 emerging market funds that go in the 11.7 trillion pension funds in the United States. So we use that trust doctrine in that area as well. We also used it when we built up our initiatives with Taiwan.
Okay, hang on. I want to rewind a little bit because I want to understand better. You mentioned, I think, 11 point something trillion dollars. Can you rewind and say what that was that you were talking about so that I can make sure I understand?
So 11, that's the amount of money that's in United States pension funds, if you add them all up.
That made up of Chinese stocks?
And there's hundreds of billions of dollars.
Like if I invested Alibaba If the pension fund owns Alibaba, that's a Chinese investment. Oh, so Chinese assets comprise $11.7 trillion.
No, that's the total pension fund. But in that pension fund, all kinds of Chinese companies are buried in there. Big ones like Tencent, Alibaba, Baidu, but also Chinese companies that aren't even on the New York or NASDAQ stock exchange. And by the way, Tencent, Alibaba, and Baidu are the three most important companies to the Chinese military's AI programs. We try to get them sanctioned. We're still trying that because those guys have hated their military buildup and all their AI.
Yeah. How worried are you, Keith, about Chinese invasion or attempted takeover of Taiwan?
Well, this is one of those things where you never get your mint, on a pillow at a night, right? I think you always have to be ready. And look, nobody wants war, but the best way to prevent war is to prepare for war. And, a big aspect of what we did is we strengthened Taiwan's sovereignty by increasing their international standing and also their prosperity. And, that's why I went over to Taiwan on that historic visit. And we formed an economic prosperity partnership with them, also a science and tech agreement with them. And that really lays a foundation for a trade agreement, because when you have that creates a halo effect, Dennis. And so that U.S. private sector comes in and invests more into a country that has a trade agreement, and then the allies do too. So from a military standpoint, it's also really important, because if there is an invasion of Taiwan, we need our allies by our side.
Yeah. Is the threat of an invasion, which gets talked about a lot, and it's probably talked about more now than it was maybe a few years ago, I don't know. Is the threat of an invasion, though, a reason to stop U.S. companies from investing in Taiwan? Has that been a difficult hurdle to clear?
We're still seeing companies invest over there because Taiwan is a juggernaut when it comes to technology, and in particular, the most important industry in the technology world, and that's semiconductors. Right. They're responsible for 80% of the most sophisticated chips in the world, and that's a Taiwan semiconductor company. And that was also one of the things that we did when we onshored TSMC into the United States in 2020, because in 2020 there was not one semiconductor company, domestic or international, that was going to invest in the United States and build manufacturing capacity. We tried to get Intel, we tried to get Samsung, we tried to get Micron, and we knew if we could get TSMC, that would allow us to put pressure on the other guys to do that. And since that onshoring, May 15, 2020, now $350 billion of investment and jobs have been committed in the United States in the semiconductor business.
And that's private money, right? That's not taxpayer money, Keith?
That's the private money that's going in. Now, we also use that TSMC onshoring as a catalyst to architect the CHIPS and Science Act, the bipartisan $280 billion act that does two things. One is it helps these companies onshore here in the U.S. because the price differential is so great, not because of labor, but because of all these other countries where it's at. They subsidize it because they know how important it is. Right. And the other amount of money is for federal R&D for national tech, for national security tech sectors like 6G, like biotech, cybersecurity, autonomous vehicles, those kind of things.
Right. Now, do you think it makes much difference in terms of China's vision and its plans? Because sometimes you get the feeling that China just doesn't give a flip. Okay, they're going to do whatever they want. So does it make a difference as to who is sitting in the White House Does it make a difference as to which party is running the government here in the U.S. as to what China is going to do regarding Taiwan?
I don't think it makes much difference. Which party's in there. I think it makes a difference in terms of our policies, what we do from a diplomatic standpoint, what we do from a military standpoint, what we do from an economic standpoint. So, bolstering Taiwan's international standing is key. And by the way, this is the biggest unifying issue on Capitol Hill. China is. I was back in Washington all last week. I met with probably 12 congressmen and senators from both sides of the aisle. And, one of the big things that we're doing right now at the Krach Institute for Tech Diplomacy is we've been asked to lead the Global Tech Security Commission, which is a unique commission because it's international. And we're trying to put together a global tech security strategy for the free world to accelerate the innovation and adoption of trusted technology.
Isn't it time that U.S. companies should start moving supply lines and jobs and work out of China altogether and moving it elsewhere? And if possible, moving it to the U.S.? And how does government go about encouraging that?
Yeah, so no doubt about it. And by the way, we're seeing that in droves. It takes a long time. I don't want to say in droves, but people are preparing for it. I don't think other than Tesla, I don't think anybody's expanded any manufacturing capacity in China over the last couple of years. And so they're looking at what we call friendshoring or onshoring here. And so, for example, in the semiconductor business, government's helping out on that. And because this is really, it's really critical. And she has cracked down on all these laws. They raided Bain Consulting's offices, and in
China.
When I was a vice president of General Motors, you could see, hey, if you build a plant in China, you're not just giving them the blueprints, you're teaching them the process engineering and training their people. And then, all of a sudden you've got the competitors pop up right next door to you, start losing your people. They've systematically done that in so many industries.
They're just out of control, and we keep believing them. Google has an artificial intelligence lab in Beijing. Why are you doing that? And it's as if U.S. companies still haven't woken up and realized these guys hate us. They're never going to do business with us. We have to get out of town.
Yeah. What's interesting for me is I've seen over the last couple of years, CEOs waking up. It was interesting in January 2020. I brought together the top, when I was Undersecretary, I brought together the top 36 CEOs in my home in San Francisco. You would recognize all their names. And it was a safe environment. Probably 2/3 of them had been to my home before. And I had them go around the room and tell their favorite China horror story. And I could tell you, it was cathartic, it was enlightening, and it was frightening. One of the things that I said is that, look, guys, out here in Silicon Valley, we say corporate responsibility is social responsibility. It's also national security. And by the way, China doesn't just want to compete with you, they want to put you out of business. And at the end of the night, you could probably divide those CEOs into three groups. One group is, well, they've been burned enough. They're not going back to China. They don't trust them. They've got the battle scars to show it. Then there's another group that was chin-chinging it, just making money. The biggest group was the one in the middle, where it's kind of like, I thought I was the only one this happened to, and tell me more. So you're beginning to see that out here in Silicon Valley. I think Wall Street is taking a little bit longer.
They still see the fee potential, I guess. It was always that idea of this huge market and all these extra buyers. And
we were awful. And we were treating them not how they truly are, but how we hope they would be.
Yes, yes, which is, on one hand, if you step outside the picture, I mean, it's just so good-hearted of America, okay? I mean, they kind of, oh yeah, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. They don't deserve the benefit of the doubt. Well, you had mentioned that the way to avoid war is to prepare for war,
Yeah.
be prepared for it. So tell me now, and we're getting ready to kind of final lap here, in terms of China and Taiwan, are we prepared to help Taiwan and do the right things? And if China made aggressive moves, what are the first things that you feel the U.S. should do in a situation like that?
Well, the first thing and the most important thing I always say, it's all about your allies, because we can't do it alone. And so that's really critically important. And President Biden has said 3 times he will defend Taiwan. So, we're shipping them arms, not as fast as we hope we would. A lot of the capacity is going to the Ukraine. We're working very, very closely with them at the Krach Institute for tech diplomacy. The other key thing is prosperity, make sure their economy's humming and all of that. So, and then also their international standing. I think that's really, really critical. And these guys punch above their weight. If you look at Taiwan, they're a linchpin of democracy. They're a role model for freedom, not just in the region, but around the world.
Yes.
And I think people realize how critical Taiwan is to this epic struggle between authoritarianism and freedom. And with the invasion of the Ukraine, I think it's kind of didn't work out quite how the love affair pact between General Secretary Xi and Putin anticipated. I think it might give Xi a little bit of a pause to see how courageous those Ukrainians have been in that struggle. Because when you're defending your homeland, it's a lot more different than when you're trying to take over somebody's homeland.
The Russians are certainly finding out about that, and as supportive as Xi and China have been, certainly, yeah, that's a great point. That maybe, everyone worried, I think, when Ukraine invasion happened, that, oh my gosh, will it make China more eager to test it and invade in Taiwan? But this notion, Keith, that maybe actually it's given them realize you might be biting off a little more than you want to chew. That's a compelling point.
Yeah, it really woke up the world. Look, Dennis, I've just been a businessman. When I went out and worked for the government, I learned the federal government is all about national security, because we've got to defend this 250-year-old experiment that we have that's called a democracy.
Yeah.
And you got to fight every day for that. And it goes against all the laws of physics, all the laws of nature, because the natural order of things is the bad king, the dictator, and the emperor. And so you've got to fight every day. And if it wasn't for the United States, there'd be, 100 companies would never taste freedom. Now, what was interesting for me, I didn't think much about that growing up in Ohio with the white picket fence, the dog, and 2.5 kids. I was 0.5 because I had 2 sisters. and you take it for granted. What was interesting for me with the invasion of Ukraine was my 11-year-old twins. Because when that happened, I remember them coming up to my office on a Saturday, and they were talking about, hey, this thing. And what these little twins saw, they saw that freedom is worth fighting for. And to keep it, you have to put your life on the line. So that is for real.
It sure is. Thank you so much for being with us today, Keith Krach, former Undersecretary of State, Nobel Peace Prize nominee, founder of successful businesses. You have this wonderful, very few people at your level of government who got that high came from the business world. And that was one of the things I liked about the Trump administration is he brought in real people who had built real companies and done real things. And instead we're focused on solutions instead of the debate. And it's so refreshing to hear it. And we look for more great things coming from you and the Krach Institute there at Purdue. And I hope they'll come on again. I just loved it. Thank you so much and have a glorious day, Keith.
Thank you so much, Dennis. It's always a pleasure.